Palestinian Liberation Front was founded by Mohammed Zaidan, better known as Abu Abbas, in 1977. In the late summer of 1985, Abbas and a handful of his PLF accomplices came up with a terrorist plot to hijack the Italian luxury liner, the Achille Lauro, and then use it against Israeli targets during a planned port call to Ashdod, Israel. So on October 5th, 1985, 4 PLF terrorists, led by a guy named Yosef Majed Molki, boarded the Achille Lauro in Genoa, Italy, using false passports and representing that they were tourists from Latin America. 2 days later, the Achille Lauro pulled into Alexandria, Egypt, and disembarked 635 of the 750 passengers to do a tour of the pyramids. The plan was, as those who disembarked toured the pyramids, the Achille Lauro was going to relocate to Port Said. Once the tour of the pyramids was done, they jumped back on the bus and joined the ship at Port Said. Now, several of the passengers later remarked that although these 4 represented themselves as being Latin American, none of them could speak Spanish. Also, they smelled of gasoline. But in spite of that, nobody brought that to the attention of the crew or made a big deal out of it. So as the ship pulled out of Alexandria, one of the stewards was bringing a bowl of complimentary fruit to the stateroom of the 4 terrorists, and he caught them cleaning their weapons. It turns out they had hidden those weapons in the gas tank of an automobile, and that's why they smelled like gas. So they were trying to clean that off of the weapons before they carried out the main part of their mission. So at that point, the terrorists just decided to hijack the ship. And so they fired into the air and had the steward take them up to the bridge, ordered the captain to take them to Tartus, Syria. Along the way, the terrorists start going through passengers' passports looking for Jewish or American passengers, and they start to separate the passengers accordingly. One of the passengers is a retired Jewish American named Leon Klinghoffer, and he's wheelchair bound. Now, they arrive off the coast of Syria, and the Syrian government tells them, basically, you can't dock here. So as a result of that ruling, the terrorists fly into a fit of rage, and Moki winds up shooting Klinghoffer in his wheelchair, once in the head, once in the chest, and then he has the crew of the Achille Lauro dump the wheelchair and Klinghoffer's dead body over the side. Now, no officials outside the ship know that this has happened yet. So at this point, Yasser Arafat, head of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, of which the PLF is affiliated, starts to negotiate with the Egyptian government. Arafat sent a delegation to negotiate with the Egyptians. The delegation included Abu Abbas. It is unclear whether Arafat knew that Abbas had been the mastermind of the hijacking. The Reagan administration is also very interested in what's going on here, although, again, nobody knows that Klinghoffer has been killed yet. So meanwhile, in the Western Mediterranean, the USS Saratoga, with carrier Air Wing 17 aboard, is finishing up a major NATO exercise called Display of Determination. Once the exercise wraps up, they're headed for Dubrovnik for a port call. At that time, Dubrovnik was part of Yugoslavia. Now it's part of Croatia. Some well-earned liberty coming up, but at the same time, they're aware of the fact that the Achille Lauro has been hijacked, and they've also been made aware that there are American passengers aboard. So the Saratoga had been on deployment since August of 1985. It was one of the older carriers in the American fleet at this time. CAG-17 was comprised of 2 F-14 squadrons, VF-74, the B-Devilers, VF-103, the Sluggers, as well as 2 A-7 squadrons, VA-81 Sunliners, VA-83 Rampagers, 1 A-6 squadron, the VA-85 Black Falcons, 1 EA-6B Prowler squadron, the VAQ-137 Rooks, an S-3 squadron, VS-30 Diamond Cutters, an E-2 squadron, VAW-125 Tiger Tails, and the helicopter squadron was an SH-3 Sea King squadron, the HS-3 Tridents. The Saratoga enters the Adriatic, still heading for Dubrovnik, but keeping an eye on the situation with the Achille Lauro. They prepare 2 S-3s to try to find the Achille Lauro, but before those S-3s launch, they get word that the Achille Lauro has docked at Port Said. So after a day of negotiation between the PLO, the Egyptians, the Israelis, and the Americans, and the Italians, they brokered a solution, which was they were going to let everyone go on the idea that nobody had been hurt, and they were going to release the terrorists basically under their own recognizance. So Achille Lauro pulls into port. The 4 terrorists jump into a waiting harbor patrol craft and make their escape. The American ambassador to Egypt comes aboard and now realizes that Leon Klinghoffer has been murdered. In fact, he sees blood on the side of the hull, and he's enraged. He calls President Reagan, and now Reagan wants those terrorists brought to justice. He goes to President Mubarak. Mubarak and the Egyptian officials say, sorry, it's too late. They're already gone, which turns out to be a lie. So meanwhile, CENTCOM, led by General Carl Steiner, mobilizes SEAL Team 6 and Delta, and they make ready to do whatever's necessary. At the same time, the USS Saratoga is told to turn around. You're not going to Dubrovnik, at least not right away. And the air wing goes into an alert 60 status, which means be ready to launch 2 Tomcats and an E-2 within 60 minutes. So the situation on the ground is developing very rapidly, and the National Security Council gets word that, in fact, the terrorists are planning to board an Egypt Air 737 and fly to Tunisia. And one of the Navy officers on the National Security team says, hey, why don't we pull a Yamamoto, which was a reference to when Admiral Yamamoto's airplane was intercepted during World War II and shot down. So President Reagan thinks that's a great idea. He wanted to make sure that what happened to Robert Stetham, Navy diver who was shot in cold blood on the tarmac of the Beirut airport, didn't happen again. So as night falls in the Mediterranean, the air wing gets the order, launch the Alert 60. And within 20-some minutes, 2 VF-74 F-14s and a Tiger Tail E-2 are airborne. Now, they're not sure what their mission is yet. They're loaded with Sidewinder missiles, and one of the Tomcats has tracers in the event they have to signal the airliner by shooting across its nose. So with his Tomcats airborne now, the battle group commander starts to formulate a plan. The plan is to create a dragnet between Cairo and Tunis, Tunisia. One of the assumptions is the Libyans will not allow this Egypt Air 737 to fly through its airspace. So that narrows the window a little bit, but it's still like trying to find a needle in a haystack, as one of the E-2 controllers framed it later. So it turns out that one of the VF-74 airplanes that launched without a radar, which pissed off the E-2 controller, and so they were put in the penalty box. That's how the sortie wars between sister squadrons used to go. You wanted to launch first. And I can just hear the conversation between the pilot and the Rio of that airplane when the Rio announced that his radar wasn't working. I'm sure the pilot, who was probably the senior of the two, just said, I don't care, we're launching first. And that ultimately played out poorly for them. Meanwhile, 4 VF-103 airplanes have launched, including an airplane with a TARPS pod, reconnaissance pod, mounted to the bottom of the airplane. So the guy who probably had the best picture overall is the skipper of the Tiger Tails, the E-2 squadron, and he launches in a second E-2, relieves the first E-2, so now he's the intercept coordinator. They establish a cap station south of Crete, opposing racetracks, 2 sections of VF-103 airplanes. They're flying with their lights out so as not to attract attention while they do intercepts. So remember, these are the days before night vision devices, so if you're flying around without your anti-collision lights on, nobody can see you. So the E-2 winds up vectoring the 103 Slugger airplanes on a number of contacts. So they'd run the intercept using the radar, go into pulse mode, pull it behind, and then get close enough to shine a flashlight from the rear cockpit on the vertical stabilizer of the airplane and ID what it is. So the first 3 airplanes intercepted were not the Egypt Air 737. They were a variety of commercial airplanes and transports that, by the way, were flying on the airways without their lights on, which kind of surprised the American air crews that so many airplanes were flying through the sky without any anti-collision lights on. They also got word from the E-2 that floggers had launched out of Libya, but when they started to turn to pursue them, those floggers immediately landed. So finally, with the 4th intercept, a VF-103 section brackets the tails from behind, gets close enough so one of the Rios can shine his flashlight on the tail, and they identify the Egypt Air tail number, which happens to be 2843. So at that point, Commander Zia, the skipper of the Tiger Tails in one of the E-2s, goes up the VHF frequency that he believes the Egypt Air 737 crew is on and says, 2843, this is Tiger Tail 603, over. He says that several times, gets no response. Finally, the Egypt Air pilots answer the call. So Commander Zia says, Egypt Air 2843, you are being escorted by 2 F-14s. You are directed, proceed to and land immediately at Sigonella, Sicily, over. The Egypt Air pilots are confused, to put it mildly, and they respond, say again, who is calling? And so Zia says, this is Tiger Tail 603. I advise you are directed to land immediately. Proceed immediately to Sigonella, Sicily. You are being escorted by 2 F-14 interceptor aircraft. Vector 280 for Sigonella, Sicily, over. So Zia winds up saying this a couple more times, and with no response, he goes up the UHF frequency and directs the sluggers to pull forward and turn your lights on. And so they do that, and that definitely gets the attention of the pilots as well as everybody else in that Egypt Air airplane. So the Egypt Air pilots come up and say, turning right, heading 280. So then the Egypt Air pilots complain to Commander Zia that the Tomcats are too close. It's unclear whether Egypt Air knows that Tiger Tail is not a Tomcat. Doesn't really matter. So he says, okay, we'll back away. And then he directs the Tomcats to give them a little more room, which they do. So it takes them about an hour and a half to fly from where they intercept the airplanes to Sicily. Along the way, they're trying to communicate with Italian controllers, and the Italians are acting like they have no idea of what's going on, and they're refusing to let the Americans and this Egypt Air airplane into their airspace. So as this continues, the Italians say, okay, you cannot land at Sigonella. We want you to land at Catania, which is slightly to the northeast of Sigonella. And I've landed at Sigonella a number of times during my career. It's a great airfield. We used to have P-3s, anti-submarine warfare airplanes, permanently based there back in the Cold War days. So that's where the Americans wanted to go. They did not want to go to Catania. And oh, by the way, a C-141 full of SEAL Team 6 was already on deck there, waiting for the Egypt Air airplane to arrive. So the Tomcats are now talking to the various agencies, and they just basically say, we're landing at Sigonella. One of the Tomcats declares an emergency for low fuel, so that sort of trumps anything else. The 737 pilot is so flustered, he winds up getting too low, so he waves off the first approach to Sigonella. Tomcats follow him around. Second time, he lands. Right behind him, a second C-141 lands. This one has Delta Force on it. So you've got two airplanes full of Tier 1 special operators ready to grab these terrorists. Now, meanwhile, the Italians have mobilized the Carabinieri, which is their special police force. There's 300 Carabinieri, and we have about 60 special operators on these two C-141s. The Tomcats do not land. They're orbiting overhead. In fact, the VF-103 airplane took this picture. And here's a TARPS picture taken by the AD-5, which is the IR camera, the infrared camera. That's one of the three cameras on the TARPS pod. So on this, you can see the 737 in the center of the picture, and you can see both of the 141s parked on one of the runways. So this is about the time that the standoff between the Americans and the Italians was getting very tense. So obviously the State Department and the White House are in comms with the ambassador and the Prime Minister of Italy, and the Italians are seriously pissed off the Americans dragged them into this situation, which sort of ignored the fact that the Achille Lauro was an Italian ship. So the standoff between the Americans and the Italians lasts about 6 hours. So finally, about 4:30 in the morning local time, they agreed to allow the Carabinieri to board the airplane and grab the terrorists. At that point, they realized that among those on the 737 is Abu Abbas, the mastermind of this terrorist plot. So that raises the stakes as far as the Americans are concerned. That evening, an Italian airplane launches out of Sigonella for Rome. So the Americans are monitoring it. They launch behind the Italians in an Air Force T-39. And as a result of them trailing the Italians call for their F-104s out of Gioia de Colle, an Italian air base on the east coast of Italy. I've also landed there once where I had a broken F-14 back when I was aboard the USS America. Great base. But they launched these F-104s to escort the T-39 that was escorting this Italian airplane that had the terrorists aboard heading for Rome. In response to that, the Americans launched a section of F-14s to escort the F-104s in company with a Prowler. So this is causing all kinds of gnashing of teeth. The Americans are told to stand down, that they are not authorized in the airspace. They wind up using the Prowler to jam the air control radar to just sort of make a graceful exit and head back to Saratoga. And then the ship pulled into Dubrovnik the next day. So the epilogue is the Italian Prime Minister, Bettino Craxi, let Abu Abbas go. Abbas was ultimately captured by U.S. forces in March of 2004 as he tried to get out of Baghdad and head for Syria. The circumstances of his death are unclear. The Americans claimed he died of natural causes in their custody. So overall, this showed a mid-80s carrier strike group at its best. The Tomcat particularly doing its thing to thwart terrorists getting away with the murder of an American citizen. And although there were a few perturbations along the way, ultimately what President Ronald Reagan said at the press conference following the event proved to be true.
You can run, but you can't hide.
All right, that'll do it for this episode. If you're a first-time viewer, please ring the bell and become a subscriber so you don't miss anything. Give me the likes and comment. Check the links below for merch and where to get the Punks trilogy, my first 3 novels about a Tomcat squadron that were just reissued by the Naval Institute Press. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider using the super thanks, the heart icon below, or become a patron at patreon.com/WardCarroll. In the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again soon.